And finally, a comment on America's diplomatic defeat relative to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The background is this. As many of you probably know, when it comes to multilateral lending institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, the United States plays a dominant role. And for the Asian Development Bank, Japan plays the dominant role. In fact, in certain circumstances relative to the IMF and the World Bank, the United States has veto power on whatever the institution does. Well, for a number of years, emerging economies, not just the Chinese, but also India and the Brazilians, have wanted a greater say in those institutions. And frankly, the United States has kind of dragged its feet in terms of addressing those concerns. It took a while for the administration to agree to a particular proposal, and right now that proposal is kind of languishing in Congress as nobody wants to even vote on it. So it's possible, even if the United States didn't drag its feet, China would have still proposed its own multilateral lending institution, and in the end, that's what China did. The Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. China founded the bank and committed to an initial investment of $50 billion. The United States opposed the AIIB on the grounds that it was concerned about transparency and governance of the institution in light of rule of law issues relative to China and China's proposed leadership of the AIIB. The U.S. said it wouldn't join the institution, and of course it was hoping its allies would not join either. And what happened in March is exactly the opposite of what the United States wanted. One by one, American allies decided they would join the AIIB. It started with the UK, and then through European countries like Germany and France and Italy, and then all the way over to Asian allies like South Korea and Australia. With the exception of Japan, about every ally the United States has signaled their intention of joining the AIIB. So you have to admit, I'm not sure if the practical implications of this are as significant as some people think, but from kind of a popular perception point of view, a diplomatic defeat that is this public is not common. And when people say that the United States has egg on its face, frankly, there's good reason. It was not the best month from a diplomatic point of view for the United States of America. So to put this situation into perspective, a couple of points to be made. First of all, I think the United States drastically underestimated just how comfortable the rest of the world is with China. We all know China's huge. It's been growing like crazy for 30 years. Most countries are already heavily invested in China, and most countries are starting to receive investment from China and want to receive more. Business leaders and even government leaders are used to dealing with China. And this rule of law issue has been present all along, as it is with all emerging markets. Most countries, business and government leaders, have found they can work around those issues, and most people, or at least a lot of people, have come to the conclusion that the best way to get China to move to the right sort of standards is to engage China, not to keep China at a distance or out of the global system. So the United States, at least publicly, they wanted to take a stand on principle, and I think they misjudged how other people are willing to take a more practical approach and to work with the Chinese. And I should also say, China has already shown that it's going to take steps in the right direction. So, for example, as it was luring the European countries into the AIIB, China announced that it would forego any type of veto power. And it's also hired a number of ex-World Bank officials to help it write its governance rules and standards. So I think in the end, there's a real good chance that not the United States, but the other countries are going to prove to be right, and that joining the bank actually helped promote better standards within the AIIB. Humiliation might be a strong word, but I think we can agree that from a diplomatic point of view, the month of March was not a good month for the United States. But from a practical point of view, what are the implications of this situation? A couple of points to be made. First of all, keep in mind that the institutions the United States dominates, like the IMF and the World Bank, they've received their fair share of criticism over the years for wasteful spending, mismanagement, and ineffectiveness. And I think if you ask most Americans what benefit accrues to the United States from leading these institutions, you wouldn't get a terribly positive response. So I'm not sure that starting a multilateral lending institution like this is the global home run that some people think it is. Secondly, investing overseas, particularly in emerging markets, is difficult. It was just about 6 or 7 years ago that China really started investing heavily in natural resources overseas. And recently, a Chinese economist issued a report in which he estimated that perhaps 80% of those overseas natural resources investments that China has made recently are losing money, either because of operational problems or because the Chinese overpaid in the first place. There's also been much talk in the past about, for example, China's increasing influence in Africa because of all their investment there. Well, at the same time, there have been at least half a dozen cases in which Chinese nationals have been kidnapped and held held for ransom in these countries by people who oppose China's presence. China's also had demonstrations against its presence in Vietnam for a number of political reasons, and in countries like Sri Lanka recently, there was a project that the government had agreed to, and then a new government came in and pulled the project out from under China. So these are the type of risks that you face when you're investing, particularly in emerging markets. The United States and its allies have seen that, and China's going to face the same kind of risks. It's also worth pointing out that one of the reasons China has such a large debt problem is because of its own infrastructure spending at home. China's done some good infrastructure spending at home, but it's also built its fair share of bridges to nowhere. And there's no guarantee that won't happen overseas as well, particularly since any project done overseas will have to be done in cooperation with the local government. So was this a diplomatic victory for China? Definitely. And 20, 30 years ago, if China continues its ascent and its platform on the world stage continues to grow, people might look back at March of 2015 and say that's when the power balance between the United States and China really began to shift. But practically speaking, this doesn't have nearly as much impact as the headlines sometimes indicate. Hopefully, the AIIB will do a lot of good for countries in Asia, but it doesn't necessarily change, in the short term, the balance of power between the United States and China and any country. It really just represents the continuing and ongoing maturity of China and its economy.